In the first 24 hours after Pearl Harbor, a 20-year-old Hawaiʻi boy named Robert Lee washed oil-covered sailors with his own hands, fired a .22 rifle at Japanese planes diving overhead, and watched his childhood friends disappear into military custody, suspected of being enemy agents simply because they were born to Japanese parents. This is the story of how Hawaii became ground zero for an untold American contradiction. The place where loyalty was questioned so severely it gave birth to the most decorated unit in U.S. military history. Welcome to the Hawaii home front that history almost forgot. On December 7, 1941, Robert Lee was sleeping in a house overlooking Pearl Harbor when explosions woke him. But what comes after? The real story was even more consequential. This is the account of a witness to American history at its most complex moment. It's about a community turned upside down, families divided by paperwork, and an entire generation of young men who had to prove their country hadn't abandoned them. It traces Robert Lee's journey from a happy young businessman on December 6 to someone who would watch his neighborhood transform into a military zone, his pier become a morgue, and his entire generation of Japanese-American friends become suspects. The real plot twist? How those same young men would go on to form the 442nd Infantry Regiment, not in spite of suspicion, but because of an unshakable determination to prove who they really were. October 1, 1921, Robert Gould Lee was born in Honolulu, the third child of a family that had traveled west across the American landscape in ways only a few Americans ever did. His grandfather had surveyed the Wyoming Territory. His great-grandfather had built railroads in the frontier, and his father, Alfred G. Lee, carried that restless spirit into the 20th century. But it was Hawaii that would be home. Robert's mother carried a different kind of legacy. Her ancestry wove together English officers stationed in St. Petersburg, British soldiers who fought the Maori in New Zealand, a Tahitian bride who chose Protestant missionaries over Catholic towns, and a family that had been among the first entrepreneurs in Honolulu. The Tahiti Lemonade Works, the first bottling factory in Hawaii, bore the family name. The mixing of these bloodlines, these migrations, these histories, made Robert neither wholly Haole nor wholly Hawaiian, but thoroughly, unmistakably of the islands. His father had jumped ship from a guano vessel in 1901 or 1902, worked the railroads under Benjamin Franklin Dillingham, and survived an accident that cost him his right hand while dynamite fishing. That same injury led to a job at the Pearl Harbor water pumping station, a position that would have enormous consequences for Robert on a specific Sunday morning 4 decades later. The Navy had noticed Alfred Lee's work ethic. A chief naval officer had promised him a job without even waiting for a formal application. That was how it worked then. That was how small connections changed destinies. Robert grew up in a government-built house perched on a knoll above the water station, high enough to see across the entire harbor. His childhood was a tapestry of ethnicities that America would later legally segregate and psychologically weaponize. The plantations surrounding Iowa where the family lived operated on a deliberate policy of ethnic separation. Japanese camps, Filipino camps, Chinese camps, Portuguese camps. The idea was to prevent workers of different nationalities from organizing. What it actually created was something more complicated, a natural laboratory of cultural exchange. Robert had friends named Bobby Fukuda. His next-door neighbors were fishermen like Mr. Chigami and his wife, a picture bride who had come too. Hawaii arranged by Japanese agents carrying a photograph and hoping for safety in a new land. When young Robert squabbled with the Chigami boys, hurling Japani and Haole back and forth the way children do, Mrs. Chigami resolved it with unexpected wisdom. She pointed at Robert. "Now you're Masaru." She pointed at her son. "Now you're Robert." From that day forward, she called him by that Japanese name. He remembers this 70 years later. He still calls her a dear lady. His barber charged a dime. When Robert got tall enough, the price rose to a quarter. The barber had a picture of the Japanese Navy on his wall, an enormous fleet photographed after World War I. The Japanese had become prominent in the Pacific. Everyone knew this. No one quite believed it would matter. The Depression happened around them but didn't crush them. His father had civil service privileges. They could buy food at the Navy commissary. There were relish sandwiches for lunch, just bread and a liberal coating of relish. No meat, but there was bread. There was milk. There were biscuits his father baked using skills learned on a Wyoming ranch. His mother made things stretch. A community made things work. When a hurricane swept through Hawaii in the late 1930s, Robert's mother brought half a dozen flooded families into their house to sleep on every available surface. Robert and his brother slept in a clothes closet because they were small. That was how people took care of each other then. Robert attended Kapalama School, one of the segregated English standard schools where the children of English-speaking households were educated separately from the plantation workers' children. It was during those early years that he formed friendships that would last his entire life. He learned to surf from beach boys in Waikiki, watching Duke Kahanamoku paddle out on a 16-foot koa board so massive it took 3 boys to carry it to the water. He learned to canoe. He worked in the pineapple fields in summer 12-hour days, cutting the crowns off pineapples with a thick glove and a knife, earning $12 for an entire season. Later, when the New Deal reached Hawaii, he got work in the cannery at 30 cents an hour, which seemed like a fortune. He was one of the first people in Hawaii to get a social security number. His number ended in 822. As far as he could tell, he was the 822nd person on the islands to receive one. By December 1941, Robert Lee was a happy young businessman. He'd graduated Roosevelt High School in 1940. Spent a semester at University High School in Oakland, California, rowing longboats in the harbor and learning about the mainland. When he came back to Honolulu, Castle & Cook hired him, one of the big 5 companies that controlled Hawaii's economy. His job was in shipping, preparing freighters for the Matson Navigation Company. He had a car. He had access to buying clothes at McInerney's store. He had a life that felt like it was beginning to open up in exactly the ways a 20-year-old man wants it to. His high school ROTC training sat in the back of his mind, a theoretical preparation for something that seemed distant. His mother's father had become the court clerk in Kailua Kona. His father remained in charge of the water pumping station. His grandfather on his mother's side had survived a stroke in 1939 or 1940, and by 1941 was bedridden in a room overlooking Pearl Harbor. The family was stable. The community was intact. Hawaii was becoming more developed every year, but it still felt like an island, which it was. Nobody really believed the Japanese would attack. The competition was understood. The Japanese fleet was known to be enormous and powerful. But December 1941 still felt like the future, something that might happen somewhere else, not here. Robert Lee had been out on a date the night before. He'd driven around the end past Makapu Point with friends, come back over the new Ioanopali, visited another friend at 1 in the morning, and didn't get home until 1:30 or 2 a.m. His mother was understanding. He'd taken her car keys with him without asking, but that was fine. She was patient with her children. He was sleeping when the explosions woke him. Except they didn't wake him to confusion. They woke him to action. His friend Lester Irish, who was spending the night at the house, rushed into his grandfather's bedroom with Robert. His grandfather had suffered a stroke. He was bedridden. His grandmother was caring for him. The two of them were living in a small bedroom adjacent to the bathroom in that house on the knoll above Pearl Harbor. Robert and Lester picked up his grandfather on his mattress. They carried him down the hill about 100 yards to where the car was parked. They put him in the back of Robert's open car and drove him up into the hills to a cave. The same cave where Robert's father had been growing mushrooms, preparing to start a mushroom growing business. They took his grandmother, too. They took a couple of ladies from nearby, the railroad station manager's wife, and another friend of Robert's mother who had a small shop in the area. Robert drove back down into Aiea town, expecting his mother and the rest of the family to arrive in her car. They didn't come. They didn't come. The attack was still happening. Robert was watching it from up in the hills, and he realized his mother still had the car keys in his pocket. He jumped back in his car with Lester and rushed back down into the town. That's when the Japanese aircraft came through, a dive bomber with fixed wheels and a low wing buzzing directly past them, shooting indiscriminately. Everybody rushed off the roads and jumped into the weeds. The plane didn't hit them. The pilot went on to do other things elsewhere, but the pier was already filling with boats. The first boats that had been servicing the ships anchored in the harbor knew about the pier at the Lee family home. They started coming in with sailors, young sailors who had jumped into the oil-coated waters. The Oklahoma had already turned completely over. Robert had watched it from his bedroom window. The entire hull had simply flipped. The Arizona hadn't flipped. It had exploded. Robert can still see the ball of fire, not really a ball, but tongues of flame shooting up separately with a sound so loud it made his body feel the pressure of the blast. The hissing remains in his memory to this day, an enormous sustained hissing that he heard from more than a mile away. What struck him most, what he carries with him now, more than 7 decades later, is the color. The hull of that massive ship, 14 inches of steel armor, turned the color of a welder's metal. Orange, red, and white-hot, from fires burning inside before the explosion itself. The entire hull turned that color before it broke apart. He knew, looking at that fire, that no one in the middle of it could have survived. When Robert and Lester got back to the pier, a crowd of oil-covered sailors was being pulled from the harbor. The water was thick with heavy fuel oil from the penetrated ships. Robert's mother came down with cakes of Fells, a soap that cuts grease, the kind Alfred Lee used for years because of his mechanical work. They hooked up several hoses to the water supply, multiple hoses running at once, 4, maybe more. They washed these sailors. They had the young men wash themselves. The men would get cleaned off, jump back on the boats, and go back out looking for their ships. More boats would come in with more sailors. More hoses would spray more soap. More men would clean themselves off and go back into the harbor. The battleship Nevada cut loose and went down the harbor. It was being attacked heavily. It was sinking before it even got to the harbor exit, so they beached it in the shallow water. The vessel had been tied up beside the Arizona. Robert watched the vessel get bombed. He watched a Japanese dive bomber come down on it. He watched the vessel's crew shoot the wing off the dive bomber. The Japanese aircraft corkscrewed through the air like a great corkscrew, a mechanical ballet of destruction, and crashed in the cane fields, killing the pilot. The broken aircraft became a souvenir for souvenir hunters across the island. Around the same time, Robert's sister had gone down to the pier early in the morning with a friend, the two of them looking to make eyes at the sailors, as young women do. Somehow, Robert is still not entirely clear how they could see over to the other side of Ford Island from where they were, but they did. They watched the battleship Utah being torpedoed. Huge columns of water rose up into the air. The two young women looked at each other. Gee, look at that. And then the Utah turned right over completely, just turned completely over. They rushed back to wake their father. Alfred was already awake to tell him what they'd seen. By mid-morning, someone came to Robert with an opportunity. Mr. Seeger, the father of a very close friend, an employee of McKesson Robbins who had been a Navy corpsman, was driving an auxiliary ambulance made from a McKesson and Robbins delivery van. Before the war, Hawaii had established a civilian defense organization. They had a blood bank, they had storage, they had sirens, they had groups of doctors prepared, and they had these ambulances. "Come with me," Mr. Seeger said to Robert. "I need help." Robert went with him to Hickam Field. They started picking up bodies. There were bodies off the airfield. Wounded people who needed to be moved. Wounded people from various helping stations who needed to be moved to infirmaries. Robert did work with the dead and the wounded. He moved people. It was concrete, necessary, and it had to be done. By afternoon, a decision came down through the military command. All the personnel, all the dependents living on Hickam Field needed to be evacuated. An attack was coming. An invasion was expected. Everyone expected to be invaded. There was no question about it in anyone's mind. Half a dozen ambulances loaded up families from Hickam Field. Robert and Mr. Seeger were part of a convoy that drove the dependent families up to Kamehameha School on Kapnalama Heights. It was getting dark. It was afternoon heading into evening, and it was completely dark. Martial law had been declared. Everyone needed to be home by curfew 6 p.m. The entire city had gone black. An MP was supposed to lead the convoy. The MP got lost. Mr. Seeger, who knew the area well, lived nearby, knew the roads. He led the convoy instead, flashing flashlights, calling out, guiding all these ambulances up the dark streets to Kamehameha School in darkness so complete that Robert could see nothing but the ambulance's front bumper. When they got to the school, the MP came screaming at Mr. Seeger, cursing him with words Robert had never heard before, threatening him, bawling him out for taking the lead, for guiding the convoy correctly, because the MP was humiliated about being lost. A couple of officers' wives told the MP to shut up and go away. In that military hierarchy, an officer's wife carried real authority. Now the ambulance had to get back to the Honolulu Armory. It had to get back in complete darkness. No lights, no house lights, nothing. Just the flames and brightness coming from Pearl Harbor, everything burning out there in the harbor. Robert took off his shirt. He put on a white t-shirt. He walked 3 feet in front of the ambulance. His driver could see in the dark. Robert walked ahead, listening. The cars were noisy, then model of Fords and Chevrolets, old vehicles with mechanical sounds. When Robert came to a break in the trees, he knew that meant a street. He listened. If he heard no cars, he would scoot across the street with the ambulance right behind him. Street to street to street, all the way back to downtown Honolulu. A couple of hours of this 3 feet ahead of a vehicle he couldn't quite see, making his way through a darkened city during an invasion scare. They got to the armory. It was exactly where the state capitol is now, on Miller Street, right there. When Robert walked through the blackout curtains into the armory, he stepped into the brightest, noisiest, most impossible scene he could have imagined. The boys from ROTC at the University of Hawaii had been called on the radio by hook or by crook and told, "Get down to the Honolulu Armory. You are now in the Army." Hundreds of boys, hundreds of them, many in uniforms. They had been handed rifles and live ammunition and told to practice. Young men, many of them Japanese Americans, many of them Nisei, were practicing with weapons they had never held before. Ted Tsukiyama was there. The Kuroda brothers were there. Other university students. Other local boys. They were terrified, exhilarated, armed with no real training and no real guidance except, this is how you hold a rifle. Robert and his friend Fred fell asleep on a couple of stretchers in the ambulance. Then they were woken up, told to help bring supplies in from storage rooms and storage sheds, warehouses full of supplies. They had to walk in front of the ambulance again in the dark, the same routine, the same techniques. Out in front, listening, crossing streets, guiding a vehicle through a city where lights meant death. It was probably around dawn when Fred received a message that the ambulance was needed back at McKesson Robbins for deliveries from their supplies. Robert said he needed to get back to Hawaiʻi to get clean clothes, to get cleaned up, to get the Marines out of his house. The Marines had moved into the Lee family home. Just moved in, because that house had the only telephone in Hawaiʻi. A communications officer needed a command post. So they took it. Robert's mother would have to do a major cleanup job later. Boots, mud, military debris scattered through their home. But his father was right there at the pumping station, and the Marines were fine. They were good guys. The station agent came out. He said President Roosevelt was going to give a speech to Congress. It was coming through on shortwave radio. The agent said, "I'm hooked up to it in my quarters on the second floor of the railroad station. Come up and listen." They all went up. Alfred Lee, Robert, Lester Irish, Mr. Seeger, other fellows who had been working at the station. They went up to the second floor of the railroad station. The windows looked straight out over all of Pearl Harbor. All of it. The burning ships, the smoke, the devastation. While President Roosevelt gave his Day of Infamy speech, they were looking out the windows and watching their ships burn. "Very many lives have been lost," Roosevelt said. They looked at each other and nodded, because up until that moment it had been energy that kept them going. Go, go, go. But hearing that phrase, looking at the burning harbor, they began to understand. Hey, this is serious. We're really in it. After the speech, Robert wanted to get back to the armory. He said he might as well be there. At least his folks would know where he was. At least it was better than sitting at home in a house occupied by Marines. He went back to the armory, and something shifted inside him. "I guess I'll join the Hawaiʻi Territorial Guard as well," he said. In the days after the attack, the young men who had been handed rifles and told they were now soldiers were put on railroad cars full of ammunition. They were taken by railroad to spots all over the island everywhere the railroad went. They were put on railroad sidings and forgotten. Ted Tsukiyama and the others were starving. They had been completely forgotten. Finally, other military personnel found them. They had to go to military places in uniforms and say, "Hey, we're starving. We need food." Then they got fed. Robert's first night guarding was in the Kaka'ako area, where they were later building high-rises. It was a residential area then. He guarded a school. He had his rifle. He had a gas mask. The school was vacant because kids weren't going anywhere. Everyone was expecting to be invaded. They were still expecting invasion. But a few days later, Robert was called back to the armory. They realized he knew something about military procedure. The Hawaiʻi Territorial Guard was being formalized. The National Guard took in many of the acceptable boys, and many of the Hawaiʻi Territorial Guard boys were going into the National Guard, but something happened to the others. The commandant of the Hawaiian Territorial Guard received orders. Senior officers came in from the mainland, from Ohio, from Wyoming, from Michigan. They took over the Japanese consulate. What they found there was documentation. When the first-generation Japanese immigrants came from Japan and had children in Hawaii, those children's names were registered with the Japanese consulate as dual citizens. They could be citizens of Japan. They could be citizens of America. If their parents wanted to send them back to Japan for education, they could do it without penalty. It was a system that made sense at the time. It was a legal system, a logical system, a humane system. The Japanese consulate had destroyed most of its confidential records the day before the war started. They did not destroy the records of these local kids. When the senior officers from the mainland saw those records, they came to one conclusion. We've got thousands of spies. All the kids who were of Nisei extraction Japanese Americans born in Hawaii were suddenly suspected. The guns were taken away from them. They were kicked out of the army. Broken-hearted, furious, asked Ted Tsukiyama. He was absolutely furious. He had just been told he was a soldier. He had held a rifle. He had been trained. And then overnight he was suspected. These kids went back to the University of Hawaii. They went back to their studies. But they were feeling patriotic. They were American kids. They knew it. They felt it in their bones. Nobody had to explain it to them. They were as American as the boys who kept their rifles. They organized something called the Varsity Victory Volunteers, the VVV. They did patriotic things. They made gardens. They painted. They made buildings for the service. They did work for the military. It was a way of proving something that should never have needed to be proven. They were loyal. They were American. They belonged. But through 1942 and into 1943, they were still just students, still untrusted, still suspected. Then something changed. By 1943, it was realized that these kids were all right. They really were patriotic. So the military organized the 442nd Infantry Battalion. An offer came out. "We have some openings for any of you young fellows who think you might want to be in the Army." They were deluged. Every kid on the island practically tried to sign up. The military gave them a very strict health check, very strict standards, but they took enough to make a battalion, and then they shipped them off to Camp Shelby in Mississippi. These kids put themselves into it, so much so that it soon became apparent that no matter who they recruited, they were going to get good kids. That's really why they first formed the battalion. Later, the 100th Battalion was formed, and the 442nd became a full regiment. Ted Tsukiyama joined. Many of Robert's friends from grade school joined. Some of those kids who had grown up in Aiea were killed with the 442nd. Robert can't quite remember all the names now, but he knows they died. Boys he knew, boys he played with, boys who became soldiers because they had to prove they were Americans. Robert's story was different. He had made it into the Navy. He joined directly from Hawaii, swore in at the old naval station on what is now Restaurant Row in Honolulu. Because he was familiar with Hawaii, because he had a driver's license and knew the island, they made him a driver. He drove Navy officers around. One of my particular duties was to drive a captain around, or other important officers, to places they needed to go, Kaneo Makapu, around the island. He drove past Army Air Force pilots diving on Rabbit Island, practicing bombing with dummy bombs full of sand. He flew in and out of Pearl Harbor on official missions with his communications officer. He got to see his parents. He got to see the harbor recover. That was the real story of Pearl Harbor, Robert believed then, and believes now. The attacks were important, yes. But the real story was the recovery, the reclamation, the rebuilding. All those ships, except the Arizona, the Oklahoma, and the Utah, were put back in service. The destroyer that had its bow blown off had a jury bow installed, was taken to Mare Island, and had a new half of a ship installed. Same ship. The Nevada was repaired, refueled, and took part in the D-Day invasion in Europe in 1944. That was American determination. That was the real story. But the story of his friends, the Japanese-American boys, that story took a different path. They had to fight twice. First, they had to fight suspicion. Then they had to fight the war. In 1944, Robert's orders came through. The Navy was sending him to the University of Michigan for a program called V-12. They were taking sailors already in service and putting them in college. OCS Officer Candidate School to prepare officers. Robert had applied for OCS. The Navy said no. They had other uses for him, but the orders came through. Michigan, starting in February 1944. Robert had a week to get there before the semester started. He took 5 days on a steam train, an old civilian train so old that the heating for the cars was a coal stove. In the front of each car, sidings, troop trains coming through, sidlings again, San Francisco to Los Angeles to Chicago, through southern routes, through El Paso, Albuquerque, all those western towns. Finally, Chicago. He called friends' parents in Chicago. They said they'd been expecting him. Get a taxi, the mother said. Come to this address. They had a nice apartment on the shores of Lake Michigan. When Robert knocked on the door, the woman opened it and said, "Follow me." "Hello, Bob, follow me." She opened another door. There was a hot tub waiting for him, clean underwear, shaving gear. A new man emerged from that bath after 5 days on a train. A few days later, when the lady suggested that Robert come over for dinner, he met her daughter. She had decided not to come. Her mother had invited Robert, and the daughter said, "You're not getting me a date." But she looked out the window. This boy didn't look too bad, so she came home anyway. They met, they conversed, they became friends. Robert Lee's military service continued. He studied. He became a supply officer. He finished the war. He married that girl from Michigan. He came back to Hawaii eventually. He had a life, but he never forgot December 7th, 1941. He never forgot washing down sailors at the pier. He never forgot the color of the Arizona's hull before it exploded. He never forgot his friends being suspected. Never forgot the moment when American loyalty was questioned, when citizenship was doubted, when paperwork made a young man a spy, and he never forgot the response. The 442nd Infantry Regiment, the most decorated unit in American military history. Japanese Americans from Hawaii who had been told they couldn't be soldiers, who proved they were Americans by bleeding on European soil, by refusing to accept the suspicion. Today, Robert Lee volunteers at the Pearl Harbor Memorial. He tells his story to people who come from all over the world. He tells them about the attack. He tells them about the witnesses. He tells them about what he saw and did in those 24 hours that changed everything. He wears a medal that says he was a witness, that says he was a survivor. But more than that, he carries a story about a place that was more complicated than mainland America wanted to admit. A place where a boy named Robert Lee grew up alongside friends named Bobby Fukuda and Ted Tsukiyama. A place where ethnicities were separated on purpose but together in practice. A place where the worst of American fear and prejudice met the best of American resilience and determination. On December 6, 1941, Robert Lee was a happy young businessman with a car and a future opening up. On December 8th, he had no home. Marines had taken it. His neighborhood had transformed. His entire world had shifted. But his friends, the ones that were suspected, they did something remarkable. They proved something that should never have needed proving. They became the 442nd. They became heroes. And Robert Lee, who was there at the very beginning, who had watched the harbor burn, who had washed the sailors, who had fired his .22 rifle at Japanese planes, became a witness to all of it. He's still witnessing. He's still telling the story, because that story matters. That story is about America. It's about what happens when a community comes together. It's about what happens when young men are suspected but refuse to accept the suspicion. It's about Pearl Harbor, not just the attack, but what came after, not just the destruction, but the recovery. It's about a 20-year-old boy named Robert Lee who woke up on a Sunday morning to explosions and lived to spend 70 years telling the world what happened next. This is a story that shaped American history. Robert Lee's voice and the voices of thousands like him remind us that Pearl Harbor wasn't just an attack. It was a moment that revealed who we are. It revealed our worst impulses, fear, suspicion, prejudice, and it revealed our best: loyalty, courage, the refusal to accept that your country has abandoned you. If you believe these stories matter, if you believe that the voices of people who were there, who lived it, deserve to be heard, subscribe now. Hit the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Because the 442nd Regiment, because Ted Tsukiyama, because Robert Lee, because the boys who were suspected and became heroes anyway. This is American history. This is the story we need to tell. Subscribe, share. Remember,